This video is sponsored by Evoto AI. Everyone is suggesting that this is the best medium format camera currently available, and what's more, the technological advancements it's made could even be the start of a new era in the mirrorless camera market. So what exactly makes this camera just so impressive and groundbreaking? Well, this is the Fujifilm GFX 100 Mark II, and it's a mirrorless camera with a huge 102 megapixel medium format sensor. Now, although that sounds impressive, that's not actually the thing that's getting people excited, because medium format cameras have been around for a while now, and they've always been known for producing incredibly high resolution images with amazing amounts of detail. But historically, they do come with a few limitations, specifically in terms of things like autofocus and burst shooting, which compared to smaller full frame and APS-C sized cameras, these hulking great beasts are noticeably sluggish. And this means that they have been typically reserved for slower paced portraiture or studio-based photography. That is until now. You see, Fujifilm is making a pretty unusual but somewhat genius play within the camera market. Up until now, most of the big players, including Canon, Sony and Nikon, have been making two types of digital interchangeable lens camera. You've got your standard APS-C sized cameras that cater for everyone, right from the beginners all the way up to the professionals and semi-professionals. Then the next step is to go for a high-end full-frame camera, which offers a jump up in image quality and usually includes more advanced features aimed at professionals and, of course, any amateurs suffering from a serious gas problem. Well, Fujifilm have already established themselves in the APS-C market, but what makes them somewhat unusual is that they've decided to completely skip full-frame cameras altogether, and instead they've decided to cultivate a new pinnacle of high-end cameras with these new, highly spec'd and very capable medium format cameras. And I assume the aim is to lure pros away from full-frame cameras to these larger sensor cameras, and with fewer contenders in the medium format arena, they can more easily dominate the market share. But in order to do that, they first need to get medium format technology up to speed so that they can comfortably contend with the likes of the Sony A1 and the Canon R3, and this Fujifilm GFX 100 Mark II is one giant step closer to that becoming a reality. Fujifilm have made big advancements in the areas of processing power and autofocus, meaning that this thing really isn't miles away from its full-frame rivals. So what exactly is a medium format camera, and why would you ever choose one over a full-frame or APS-C sized camera? Well, you probably already know that full-frame and APS-C sized camera sensors are modeled loosely on the size of their traditional film stock counterparts. Well, digital medium format cameras are kind of the same thing because they're modeled on 120 medium format film stock. Actually, technically the film stock is a fair bit larger than the sensor in this thing, but the point is the sensor is much larger than a full frame chip, around 70% larger in fact. Now, as I already mentioned, this specific camera can output up to 102 megapixel images, which is just ginormous. Also, fun fact, an interesting side effect of using a medium format camera, if you want to call it a side effect, is that in order to work out what the equivalent focal length will be compared to a full frame camera, you actually have to times it by 0.79. So for example, this 55mm f1.7 lens I've been using actually has a full frame equivalent focal length of around a 44mm lens on a full frame camera. Now, of course, there are going to be some downsides to having a much larger sensor, and the most obvious one is that you need to build a much larger camera body in order to house it in, as well as making the lenses much larger. Now, just for some context, this medium format body alone is around 400 grams heavier than my full frame Sony A7 Mark IV. In fact, this medium format 55mm lens that I've been banging on about weighs more than my Sony body by itself, and once you've mounted it to the actual camera body, it weighs over 1.8 kilograms combined. So needless to say, this probably isn't the best choice for travel photography or if you have a back that's made of cardboard like I do these days. But on the flip side, the bigger body does mean that there is much more real estate for buttons and switches, and long gone are the days where your pinky finger is awkwardly swinging off the bottom of the hand grip. I'm looking at you, Sony. Now, speaking of button layout, this is one thing I think Fujifilm have absolutely nailed with this camera. 90% of the buttons are within reach of your right hand, and provided that you have large enough digits and the forearm strength to match, you can actually navigate most of the settings single-handedly. Weirdly enough, a lack of forearm strength is not something I've ever struggled with, and I can't think why. Anyway, there are two main command dials on this thing, one at the front and one located at the back above the thumb rest, and both of these have a click functionality too. Although there's no D-pad, you do at least have a joystick for navigating the menu and quickly adjusting the AF point. Or of course, you can use the touchscreen functionality. Now, I've got to say, I did forget how much I missed having a good old-fashioned top plate until I picked up this camera. But I will also admit that the LCD panel on this is way nicer and larger than the one that I had on my old Canon 5D Mark III from way back in the day, and it also has greater functionality too, as you can use this button button beside it to toggle through a bunch of different displays, all of which are fully customizable. Plus it also has these 3 handy shortcut buttons just above it which correspond to the settings at the top of the display, which again can obviously be customized to suit your shooting style. Now although there's not a manual exposure compensation dial, which is something I use quite frequently, I did just set one of these shortcut buttons so that when I depress it I can use the rear command dial to quickly under or overexpose my shots when needed. On the opposite side of the camera there's a lockable mode dial with the standard MASP options alongside 6 customizable modes. There's also a switch on the top here to switch between photo and video capture, but we'll stick to photography now because I want to talk about video features a little bit later on. Below that, the large LCD screen on the back can be pulled away from the body and tilted for shooting at either high or low angles, and if you're shooting vertically it can pull out this way too. Alternatively, you can also use the included EVF on the top, which is absolutely massive and crystal clear. Or if you rarely ever use an EVF and instead you'd much prefer to slim down the profile of this camera, you can actually remove this EVF completely and that reveals a separate hot shoe underneath, which I think is a pretty cool idea. But obviously, like most things in life, what really counts is what's on the inside. So how does this 102 megapixel chip actually perform? Well, I wanted to start things off a little bit more slowly than usual, so I decided to head out and take some portraits. And as you can see from these photos, the amount of detail captured in these huge 102 megapixel images is just incredible. However, for portraits in particular, this may not be a good thing because it does mean that all of the flaws are on show, and that could mean more retouching work afterwards, unless you use Evoto AI. Now, Evoto AI is an AI-driven photo editing tool that makes retouching portraits super quick and easy. Simply drag your portraits into Evoto. You can import JPEGs if you like, but here I'm going to be using unedited RAW files straight out of this camera. You can then apply one of these color grades to start off with and move on to retouching afterwards. The amount of adjustments you can make is pretty impressive, including removing dark circles, brightening teeth and eyes, removing smile lines and wrinkles, as well as reducing or removing blemishes and freckles. So you don't have to worry about applying masks or making manual adjustments. The AI will sort all of that out for you. And the best part is, if you're editing a series of images like I am, these adjustments can be synced across the whole set of photos. Now, Alice is a professional model, so naturally she has very nice skin. So what happens if we edit a more challenging portrait like this? Well, as you can see, with just a few clicks, we are getting high quality, supernatural looking edits, and all of this took me just a few minutes to do. Plus, it's not just skin it can retouch, it can also remove wrinkles from clothing and also change the color of the background. Now, Evoto is completely free to sign up and use right away with unlimited edits and no monthly subscriptions. You only pay if and when you want to export your final image. But if you sign up using the link in the description below, new users can even receive 30 free credits, so you can also export your first few edits totally free of charge. Anyway, we kind of all knew that this thing was capable of capturing great portraits, but with the impressive list of improvements made to this camera, a lot of people are now suggesting that it can handle itself in more challenging scenarios, including for street photography. And that's partly because it now includes things like an improved IBIS system, offering up to 8 stops of stabilization depending on which lens you use. It also shoots up to 8 frames per second in continuous burst shooting, and if you pair this thing with a high-speed compact flash card, you can basically rattle off seemingly unlimited numbers of raw images without it ever showing any signs of slowing, which is just insane. I should also mention that although this camera can also accept a single SD card, you shouldn't expect the same kind of write speeds when using one. But most importantly, the AF on this thing has seen a dramatic improvement. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and suggest that this thing is as quick or as accurate as my Sony a7 Mark IV or any of the newer Sony bodies that I reviewed on this channel, because unfortunately it just isn't. But that's not me saying that this is a bad camera, because it's far from that. And in the context of street photography, I found that it's more than capable of capturing candid moments of everyday life. Now, this is largely helped by the updated AI features on this camera too, including face and eye recognition, as well as a suite of other AI recognition options that allow it to identify and track things like animals, birds, cars, bikes, planes, and trains. The AF tracking on this thing also works pretty well too, though the thing that ultimately makes this camera feel like you're just cheating is the 102 megapixel resolution. Now, with this many pixels to play around with, it doesn't matter if you spot someone over the other side of the road and you only have a 55mm prime to hand, because even if you cut out 3/4 of the image, you're still left with a 25 megapixel image at the end of it, which is just madness. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that that is a practice you should adopt all of the time, but just to have the ability to make such dramatic crops and still end up with high quality results could certainly be a real lifesaver. Now, the only downside, of course, is that 102 megapixel RAW files do require a fair amount of data, but luckily you do have a few options. The first option is to shoot in compressed RAW instead of uncompressed RAW, and this takes the file sizes down from around 110 megabytes to 70 megabytes, which is a touch more manageable.
Are you serious?
Or if editing just isn't your thing, with this being a Fujifilm camera, unsurprisingly, it has access to Fuji's range of film simulation modes, so you can capture beautiful looking JPEGs straight out of the camera with no editing required. Now this GFX 100 Mark II also includes a brand new film sim called Reala Ace, and it actually produces quite a nice natural looking image, which I'm a big fan of. These shots were taken using the vanilla settings, but obviously these can all be tweaked further using the in-camera settings to suit your own style and preference. But the one thing we haven't talked about yet is video, and this is where having a larger chip potentially allows the camera to do some fairly wild things. Now unfortunately I didn't have enough time to extensively test out all of the new video features because there are quite a lot of them and I only get to have this camera for a very short amount of time, but I did try out the basics. And the biggest one is arguably the ability to capture 8K video footage up to 30 frames per second, as well as 5.8K at a wide cinematic aspect ratio. And we all know how much I love a cinematic crop, much to the disgust of some people in the comment section. But if all of that is just a little bit overkill for you, then there are also the more standard 4K and HD options allowing capture up to 60 frames per second. But going back to the 8K footage, this isn't completely without its drawbacks, and besides there being a noticeable 1.5 times crop, there's also an ungodly amount of rolling shutter. But at the very least, having the ability to capture decent 4K footage on a camera like this is impressive enough for me, because it means that it's not only a formidable stills camera, but also a fairly capable videography tool, bringing it one step closer to being a viable option for hybrid shooters. But anyway, I imagine at this point you are all dying to know, what is the cost? Well, brace yourselves, because body only this camera will currently set you back around $7,500. But before you completely write this camera off, this is what I think you need to bear in mind. Sure, most of us will never be able to afford this camera in our lifetimes, but I'm personally okay with that, because what excites me most about this camera release is just the fact that this kind of technology actually exists, and it's only going to get better from here on. And naturally, as we see with most high-spec cameras like this, it's only a matter of time before this technology starts to trickle down into the lower tier cameras, and that means that once the lines start to blur in terms of price and capabilities between the top tier full frame cameras and these new wave of medium format cameras, at the very least, cameras like this are going to become a very tempting option to consider.